Welcome to the J&J Show. I'm Jeff, he's Jerry, and tonight we're going to be continuing our discussion on cryptids, this is actually going to be part 7 of our series titled Giants in the Bible, Nephilim, and Cryptids. And, we obviously haven't talked about just Nephilim or just Sasquatch. We've discussed many other types of cryptids as well and their unusual behaviors and how they interact with people, which is what brings us to our topic tonight, and that's habituation. And that's where, correct me if I'm wrong here, Jerry, people or families, like whole families sometimes develop generational relationships with these beings that carry on for, I've heard some where they carry on for like 40 years, 50 years or more.
Yeah.
And it goes back to a lot of, grandparents and great grandparents having discovered these things and started a relationship. And I think a lot of it revolves around gifting and, we've heard, or we as in me and Jerry, and I'm sure if you're watching this and you're into the cryptid topic, then you've heard a lot of stories as well that a lot of them are positive, but usually they're positive until they're not positive. And we've heard quite a few stories, Jerry. You and I think we may have talked about it just in passing, just me and you. We probably talked about on this channel how things can turn bad real quick
Yeah.
in these types of situations. Where I know one comes to mind where this woman had developed a relationship. I don't think it was for generations or anything like that, but it was for a couple of years, and she was gifting back and forth with these beings, the Sasquatch, and she stopped. And then this thing it pretty much went on a rampage through her garden, and I think it tore up her porch or something like that. And it turned out really, really bad for her when she stopped on her part gifting with this thing. And that brings me to my next point, which is we only ever see this with Sasquatches. We never see it with any other type of cryptid. Dogman, crawlers, Wendigo, Skinwalkers, anything. We never see it with any other type of cryptid. It's only with Sasquatches, and we have theories about that we'll get into when we get in further into this episode. But I'm going to turn it over to Jerry now and let him go into further detail about this.
Well, you're right. The that one lady that was doing that. If anybody wants, I can pull up what episode, but it's detailed on the Brenton Sawin show, which we've referenced on here several times, and he's interviewing a lady who uh, lived next door to this lady, the old lady you're referring to, who had been gifting these things. It was multiple creatures that she was gifting, and it went bad. You could say not only did they tear up her garden, but they kicked down the door and drug her off into the woods, and she was never seen again. And what she had done was she put a lock on her outdoor freezer where she had kept a bunch of meat, and she had always kept the meat, the freezer full of meat for them to come and get. And then one day she put a lock on it, and that they didn't understand, and they became quite angry. I'll pull that up here in a minute and be able to give it to you in case anybody wants to listen to it, because the
Yeah,
lady
and
who's given this.
we'll add that into the description below.
Yeah, the lady who's given the report. I mean, she breaks down and cries numerous times. I mean, she witnessed a human being drug out of their house into the woods and was never seen again.
That's crazy.
And yeah, and of course the authorities, I think, blamed it on a black bear or something like that. That's what they always do.
Wild dogs.
Wild dogs, right? Swamp gas.
Yeah.
And but no, this subject is something that I was not really aware of. But it's like you said, it's been going on for a long time. We hear of accounts going back to the early 1900s, and we know that it's still going on to this day. There are, and we'll talk about that as we go, about some of the incidences that are going on right now. And what happens here with this habituation thing is that people either unintentionally or intentionally start having interactions with these beings, and usually it's the squatches that show up around the person's house. Sometimes it can take place out in the woods where like a hunter will encounter them or whatnot. I've read about these occurring in Florida, Tennessee, Ontario, Oregon, Texas. So it happens all over the place. And there isn't like so many things here. There's not one particular type of experience these people have. But in some of them, the people get quite familiar with these creatures to the point of sitting beside a campfire, they claim. And some of them, when they, more recent ones, they have managed to, the guy in Ontario, you can go on YouTube, and it's called Sasquatch Ontario. And most of his encounters are at nighttime, but he has recorded a lot of vocals with this being that he's named, the Squatch that he has a name for. And you can listen to the audio and tell that this is not just a person playing around. The volume of this voice that comes out of the woods is impressive. And I remember one time I was listening to it while my sons were playing a video game, and I wasn't aware they were listening as well. And this thing just at one point during its gibberish, because that's basically what this thing speaks, is kind of you can't really talk at all. These beings don't seem to be able to communicate like we do, although, as we've said before, they certainly can through mind speak, but we'll get into that probably some other night. But this thing just burps as it's talking right in the middle of saying its gibberish. Some people say they have their own language, others say it's just gobbledygook, but it just burps. And one of my sons said, wow, he just burped. And you can hear this burp echo through the woods, you know. And now a lot of these people that do these habituations really very quickly get attached to these creatures, and it's almost to the point of worship. The Sasquatch Ontario guy, you can tell that this is his religion. I mean, he adores these beings and thinks that that they're the answer to all of mankind's problems. And that's very common. And there is that's a trend that we'll get back to. There's an important catch with that we can talk about later. But I want to hand it back to you. Just that's kind of to give people an idea of what these things are, these habituation situations. I know there's some going on in New Mexico and Arizona right now. Usually it takes a long time, people say, to get this started, because these creatures are extremely cautious. Some of them never do progress beyond nighttime encounters to where all they ever see is silhouettes or shadows. But it's there's enough accounts out there to where you know that it's not just being invented by crackpots.
Right. That brings to mind I was listening to Vic Cundiff and the Dogman encounters, and this woman encountered a female juvenile Dogman, and you could just tell she was borderline worshiping this creature. Yes. The way she spoke of it, you've heard that episode, right?
Yep.
It's almost like there's love in her voice as she speaks of this creature, and she even gave it a name, and she's very fond of it and wants to go out and find it again. And that's the start of a very dangerous set of events that could possibly happen there. But I guess when you're that lost, you try to cling on to anything to try to fill that void within you that only God can fill. And you know, you look outside to different things, and you know, these beings are supposed to be fictional and stuff. And I guess it's kind of like just like in the Old Testament, where you know, Moses would turn his back for a second and they're all off worshiping some idol and making some little, like, you know, golden bull or something to worship. So it's not that far fetched that people would become that attached to these creatures and make it their religion. Like you said, that he very clearly worships this thing. I haven't heard the gentleman you're talking about. I'd very much be interested in hearing the clips of this thing speaking.
Oh yeah, so, something.
But yeah, that'd be crazy to listen to. Is it almost like the samurai speak?
This one actually is not. This thing sounds like he's trying to repeat certain words, but like the guy's name, Mike, the thing says that, tries to say his name all the time. But he ends up just, he can barely say it. And so it's a very different, the samurai chatter is very distinct. You're right about that. That's something, their vocals and their languages and whatnot. I believe personally, like we've discussed on here, that these beings got the Nebuchadnezzar treatment that we've outlined before on here, that they were smitten by the Lord, and that these beings at one time were the giants. And just like the Bible tells us, when Nebuchadnezzar lifted himself up as being God or equal to God, the Lord smacked him down, and he grew hair all over his body. He went out into the woods. He had the mind of an animal and lived out in the wilds until the Lord brought him back. Well, these beings seem to match that exactly. They clearly have abilities that are not animal abilities. The mind speak, as upset as people get to hear about that, I mean, it's just documented over and over and over and over and over again. Animals don't do that. So the ability to do mind speak, we know, is of that realm, the supernatural realm. But yet these beings are covered with hair, and they aren't able to communicate, and talk, and they live out in the wilds. And we do know, like we said before, that they are half their DNA is from the human line. So they come from us. This tree hugging type mentality you hear, that we could learn from them. They were here long before us. No, they weren't. The DNA shows they came from us. And that gets into what I really wanted to mention tonight, was the DNA study that they did, which was very well done and produced amazing results. And one of the scientists, one of the many that worked on it over the course of 5 years, was named Melba Ketchum. The fact that her name isn't more well known right now is amazing, because she and that group basically discovered Sasquatch DNA. The universities, Texas A&M, all sorts of big universities, they sequenced the DNA. They weren't told what it was DNA to. When they saw what they had, they became extremely excited and came back and told Melba Ketchum, "You've discovered a new being. What is this?" And they thought that this was DNA from some animal, from something that had been dead for a long time. And she said, "Well, it's Sasquatch DNA." They didn't miss a beat. They instantly said, "Don't ever call us back. Don't report that you did this. If you mention us in your report, we'll sue you." And they sent all the stuff back to her, and have never ever refused to acknowledge they even worked with it. And this happened with 3 different major universities. So the reason I bring all that up is because Melba Ketchum, as a result of being attacked, and she's been viciously, her career basically was ruined. She had never been into cryptids or anything like that. She just agreed to do this study because she was into DNA. And the study, the group, which had a bunch of scientists, they asked her to lead it. So she agreed to do the DNA part. Well, with her career basically wrecked after this study they did, she realized that these beings were real. She had been a skeptic before, but she realized that they were real. And then, as so often occurs, because she had been working in this field for a long time, she begins to have sightings of her own, which happens all the time. She even had Dogman sightings on her ranch, where one attacked her horse. Somehow, some way, Jeff, she's befriended these people who are habituators. They have this group, this clan they call of Squatches in Texas, East Texas, that they have befriended, and they go out and play flutes and leave vegetables and do all kinds of stuff. I don't know if they hold hands or not, but that kind of situation. And she has said, and you can tell she thinks a lot of these creatures too. So I guess some of them actually come around her house too. And she thinks a great deal of these beings, very highly. And she says so much so that she limits how much she goes out to interact with them, because she says you can see where it'd be very easy to start worshiping them. And as a Christian, she doesn't want to do that. And so I think, to your point, the reason why people tend to go this direction is because these beings do have a supernatural side to them, and people are drawn to that. And so here we have somebody And she said that some of these habituators, these people, because as people get into interacting with these things, they begin to have different experiences. Apparently, the guy in Ontario I told you about, he began to notice that when they would stay at this cabin, and it was on somebody else's property, they had permission to stay there. And they would stay at this cabin and go out into the woods and interact with these beings. While they were in the cabin, out of nowhere, they said a marble would appear out of thin air and drop to the floor. And they're like, what on earth? And then they would find on their digital cameras pictures that were showing up on their digital cameras they didn't take. Weird pictures. And so all this kind of stuff begins to happen. The woo stuff it's referred to, the weird stuff. And Melba said that a couple of these habituators said, yeah, if you come out here long enough, you'll experience the takeover. Basically, it's a situation where these beings are able to, for lack of a better word, possess someone and control where they go. I'd never heard of this until the interview that I heard where Ketchum was talking about this. And they said it doesn't happen a lot. She's never experienced it. She said she never intends to experience it. But these people talked about, no, it's weird. And, they acted like it was kind of a neat thing, like a rush, it's weird. You just don't, and they have missing time, and they'll find themselves in places they don't even know how they got there. And it's these beings that are able to channel in and possess them briefly in order to control. And the first thing I thought of, Jeff, was that would explain why a lot of these 411 cases, the people just take off and wander, because a lot of those missing 411, I'm convinced, are squatches that just snatch people. But in other cases, you can see the footprints show where the individual did in fact walk off in some weird direction, inexplicably. And I think that this gives us a clue that these beings have this ability to get in people's heads and cause them to do. I remember one, I'll shut up after this. I remember one of the first ones I read about, this two guys were on a bike trail and one guy was up in front of the other. The guy in the rear came down the trail, and the first guy had stopped his bike and was in the process of taking his clothes off. And the second guy was like, what on earth are you doing? And the guy just kind of like snapped out of it. And he was like, I have no idea what I was doing. He said, but I would have walked up in that, I would have walked in that direction had you not come around. I was intent on walking over that ridge. And what's funny is in the missing 411, we find where a lot of times a person's gone, but they find their clothes neatly folded up. And why would somebody take their clothes off? Like, oh, well, in hypothermia, people do that sometimes. Do people get hypothermia in the middle of the summer? Not usually. And so it doesn't explain all the cases. And usually people with hypothermia don't fold the clothes up either. So that's just a whole bunch of information there that I thought would be interesting for us to kind of roll around.
Right. Yeah. Well, that, and they find their backpacks neatly placed by trees. They'll find their shoes with their socks neatly folded on top and stuff, and the shoes are sitting side by side, just neatly sitting there. And that might explain why I'm always go back to this one story where this gentleman, he gets out, parks in the parking lot right at the trailhead, walks down the trail, he's in the middle of his hike, sees a Sasquatch. Next thing he remembers, he's walking back out at the trailhead into the parking lot. So that, what'd you call it?
What's that?
What did they call it? Where they possess
Missing
you?
time.
Yeah. No.
They didn't have a name for that. They
okay.
didn't have a
Gotcha.
term for it.
I thought you said
it just happens.
Yeah. So that could explain that and why that happens.
Yeah.
And there's another story
Yep.
where it's a bit of a different story, but it's happened in North Carolina in the mountains, where a young man, I guess his 20s, and a small boy went missing. There's two separate incidences. They both found a cabin that was not there. They took the people back to where the cabin was supposed to be. The cabin was just completely gone, but they both disappeared for a few days and then just reappeared. But the thing about the man is he was sitting with a group of friends. It was kind of cool. It was getting dark. They're sitting by the fire. He had his shirt off, and he just gets up barefoot, gets up, walks into the woods. They're yelling his name. He doesn't respond. He just keeps on walking and disappears for, I forget how, it might have been a few days, might have been a week. I forget exactly how long, but he just reappears. And, there's no telling. I mean, luckily they came back and they didn't disappear for good, but
Right.
that that's very weird and strange and fascinating all at the same time that they
Right.
mention this, because there's so many stories that involve circumstances just like that, where not just missing 411 stories, but cryptid encounters where
Yeah.
people have huge losses of time, like huge chunks of time, sometimes for hours. And it also happens in UFO stories.
Yeah.
Not to branch too far off the cryptid trail, but it happens a lot in those stories too. And we are under the belief that these things are all part of the same team,
Oh yeah,
UFOs and
definitely.
cryptids. So
Yep.
if some of them have supernatural abilities and are able to do that, then why not others? And speaking of their supernatural side, I mentioned earlier about how the Sasquatches are the only ones that this habituation happens with.
Mhm.
And I think this is just me. It's just something that came to my mind. They're half human, half angel. And angels are absolutely just infatuated with humans. They are very, very interested in us. And, because, and I've heard where it's because we're made in the image of God. And that's why they're just completely taken with us. So it would make sense that Sasquatches, being half angel, half angelic, would also be infatuated with humans. Maybe that's where it comes from. And there's a wide array of temperaments with the Sasquatches, a wide array of personalities, I guess you could call it, where some of them are friendly. I've heard accounts of habituation where it's friendly. I've heard stories where people have positive encounters with these beings. And obviously there are the other side of the coin to that, where people have horrific encounters with these things. So maybe the temperament comes from their human side. And it's really fascinating once you start going down these rabbit holes into these lines of thought to try to figure this out. And unfortunately we'll never know the truth for sure, but you know that is it's weirdly fascinating that he would mention that specifically. If you're there long enough, you'll experience that. Well, why would you even want to experience that?
Right.
Why would you want to completely lose control and just wake up naked halfway into the mountain range? Why? I don't see the fascination with that, but obviously I'm not missing that piece that God whole shape in my heart anymore. So I don't understand why they would want to do that. But the marble disappearing or just appearing out of thin air and dropping to the floor, there's a lot of people that think, and there's a lot of accounts where people believe they can cloak themselves, and they have encounters with what they describe as predator type
Yeah. Yeah.
camouflage.
A
Not
lot.
not not predator type beings,
Right.
but these things are able, whatever it is able to use the cloaking like the predator did in the movie. And
Yeah.
if that just kind of points to that too, where the picture thing is bizarre. I don't even know how to begin to try to unravel that one, but you know, I guess they've been able, again, story after story after story, where it gets to the point where it's once or twice, that could be made up, that could be coincidence, that could be explained away by logic. But when you get story after story, thousands and thousands of stories coming in from all over the world, you kind of start to believe this stuff is actually going on. And
Okay.
the way that paranormal encounters, UFO encounters, cryptid encounters, people talk about how their flashlights shut off, brand new battery shut off, phone charged to 100% goes dead. And these things are able to manipulate electronics that way. But I've never heard of mysterious pictures showing up. I've heard of, phone shutting off, cameras shutting off, flashlights shutting off, but never ever heard of mysterious
Well,
pictures.
one of the most prominent cases, because it was I forget what kind of scientist, but this woman and her husband were like nuclear physicists and were employed at some university. And they contacted David Paulides because the woman was actually a bow hunter, and towards sunset was in a tree stand and was hunting, and encountered in the next tree over, looked and saw the predator shimmering like you're talking about, and couldn't believe it, and watched this thing. And she describes it, and this is on one of David Paulides's videos, the Hunted, I believe, is one of his videos. And then she goes back, and her phone had a picture inserted on it that nobody can explain. And these people are both, like I said, they're like nuclear physicists. These are extreme science types, and they found out that at the same time she had this encounter, about a mile away at the local high school, they were having band practice, and they had a mass UFO sighting. And so, make of it what you will, but here you had an image being put on a phone. The image didn't really make any sense as far as you couldn't really see anything clearly. And a lot of them are kind of blurry, and a lot of them you can faintly make out like the outline of something, but none of them are ever very, very clear. But the Ontario Sasquatch guy, he had that happen to him with the marble and the phone regularly. It wasn't just a one-time thing. It happened a lot. And, the reason why the Enoch thing is important, and I think it connects in perhaps to why it is that the habituation occurs with Squatches and not the others. If you look at the book of Enoch, he talks in there about there being different groups of these creatures. You had the fallen angels, which originally fell, and then you had their offspring, which were the Nephilim, or the Nephal. And then there was another group that Eluid, or there was a Jewish name. Basically, it translates out to the monsters of all things. And this was a group of beings that were genetically created. They weren't the product of a union between angels and women. They were the product of petri dish type mixing of genetics. And what's amazing about this is that people didn't understand this could even be done when Enoch wrote this. We didn't really understand this could be done until like the 1960s. But here Enoch wrote this stuff, thousands of years ago. We know that he must have been right, because the science that he describes has now been borne out, and they're actually doing it. So it validates itself. But my theory, and again, it's just a theory, is that these other cryptids, the Dogmen and the other weirdo stuff that you have out there, are remnant of those, what they refer to as the monsters, which were a group. There was another group, in addition to the giants. There was another group that was of created beings that we don't know where they came from. There were several different groups. They all vied against each other, and a lot of them were wiped out in the flood. Most of them, all of them were wiped out in the flood. The problem is, the Bible says that when the flood subsided, man came out, that one of the descendants of Noah's sons found tablets upon which it described how to do this genetic stuff. And so man again began tampering with the genetics Why they did this, we're not really sure. We have a clue into why the angels did what they did, but why, mankind seems to have joined in with this genetic manipulation. It wasn't just the angels. Initially, it was just them. But after the flood, it was pretty much a human sponsored thing because the angels had been bound and put in prison. So we think there was something probably going on with the Tower of Babel, where some of that may have been involved as well.
You mentioned how in the days of Enoch, when he wrote about them genetically manipulating these creatures and making new ones and splicing DNA and putting them together, it really makes you wonder how advanced they were as a people, as a society, how advanced technologically they were before the flood. And there's a lot of speculation on this. You and I have talked about this before, about how there are, I don't want to say symbols, drawings, pictures just carved into the landscape that are so big that you can only see it from up high. And it's almost like they had a way to fly or be up that high to see these designs in the ground. And how, I mean, I just don't, unless they had help from fallen angels, unless they had help from, you know, the enemy, how are they splicing these creatures together? How are they taking DNA from one and from two different things and mixing them together? It's really baffling to think about because it really doesn't say how much time in the Bible. It really doesn't give us an exact amount of years it was from the creation of mankind to the flood.
Mhm.
It in Genesis, it actually just kind of I don't want to say it breezes over it, but it gets there pretty quickly without. And I guess it does that for a reason, because
Right.
I'm not even going to try to get into the the thought process there because it's probably something beyond my comprehension anyway. But it really just makes you wonder how advanced they were to be able to do that back in those days. Did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah,
Or
they it, Enoch makes very clear that the angels taught them. So everything they got on that front, they got from these fallen angels, and it goes into not just the mixing of animals, but also all sorts of other things they were teaching them: how to make weapons, instruments, how to even do makeup. In order the coloring of the eyes they talk about to make the women. They had a potion that they would give to some of their wives. They would have multiple wives, and they would have some wives they would keep for childbearing, and others they would give a potion to cause abortions so that their shape, their figures would not be messed up. All these things the angels were teaching them. So they were getting this information, this knowledge from them. And Enoch even goes into how they would take 200 of a particular type of animal, 200 pairs, in order to try to genetically alter them because it wasn't going to happen on the first try. And some of them wouldn't survive. And of course, when you're talking about hybrids, the hybrids typically cannot produce. Now they can produce in limited amounts. However, it's not prolific. They're not going to be able to reproduce in large numbers. But Enoch even gets into all that, describing how they would take a lot of animals and to do this, and how they sinned against, is what the term he used. They sinned against. They altered fish and just birds. Basically the sky was the limit. They were trying to create their own, and we never really get 100% of an idea of why the angels wanted to do this. We figure that more than likely they were trying to, they had some agenda, or they were trying to play God. Why mankind wanted to get in on this, we really don't know. We don't know to what extent mankind was participating. Although after the flood, we know it was mostly man driven, because there's no evidence at all that there was an angelic incursion after the flood. We know there were giants on the earth after the flood, but there's no mention anywhere about angels doing it again. Matter of fact, they get smacked down so bad because of the pre-flood behavior that it's hard to imagine any of the others doing that behavior again. And the 200 that came down to Herman that first started this are chained in the abyss, is what Enoch said. So they're not even around to do it again if they wanted to. And so there's a lot we don't know. I mean, nobody should ever claim that, we know exactly what went on, because we surely don't. But Enoch does give us, and like we've said on here before, Enoch can be considered accurate history, so much so that the Bible quotes from it in 2 different places. And all the early church fathers, I can't say all, the vast majority of church fathers that we're aware of considered Enoch accurate and dependable information. And of course, we know from the book of Enoch also that that's where we get demons from. God did not create demons. Demons are the disembodied spirits of these beings, particularly the giants, is what it says, when they're killed and their body. And you know what's interesting also, I'll just throw this out, that there were so many after the flood that man begged God, asked God, whether, I can't remember if it was Noah or somebody else, that the demons be removed because there were so many. And apparently the vast majority of them were also sent to Tartarus or banished. And so what we have left here is only a tiny percentage of the original number of demons that were on the earth. But that in the end days, the last days during the tribulation, they'll all be let go. And the percentage is huge. It's like 90% of them were the Lord removed from the earth in order to give mankind a chance, because there were so many of them. But 10% were allowed to remain. And in the last days, the rest. And you can't help but think about all those beings that are released in Book of Revelation from the pit, and whether that's them or not, because it talks about all these horrible creatures coming up out of the pit to make war upon mankind. That's a different subject, I guess, for a different day.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it makes. I mean, and they're all. Well, I was going to say they're all described. Are they even described anywhere in the Bible as to what types of creatures it will be coming out of the pit? Just, I know it's abominations and stuff like that. Just
those right there are described like a locust, and they have over them the destroyer, or Abaddon, or Apollyon, as he's also referred to. And so, but one gets the impression that the locust is a symbolic representation, because locusts were, in the Old Testament, were this a symbol of awful things coming upon you, if locusts were coming upon you. So I'm not one to go in and take everything in Revelation and make it symbolic, because there's a lot of reality there, a lot of literal, but there's also a lot of symbolic. You can't do away with one or the other.
Actually, I was going to say they're described as these creatures. I think it's in these near-death experiences where people go to hell, where they describe what these creatures in hell actually look like. And they usually described as half man, half beast, and they're usually kind of described similarly to cryptids, to what cryptids look like. So I think that's what I was thinking. I confused it a little bit there, but it's the near-death experiences where people describe what they see when they're in hell, and it is very, very similar, if not the exact same thing, as to what Sasquatch or Dogman are described as looking like, by people who have seen them. So it really makes you. I mean, I said it before. It's pretty obvious to me and Jerry what team we think the cryptids are playing for, and it's when that veil is lifted, I think they're going to join right into whatever is released from those pits, and they're just going to run rampant, because dogmen get that sick, twisted pleasure out of just scaring people, and it's almost like they feed off of it. So, and obviously something's holding them back, because they're not just going around attacking and killing.
Right.
So something's holding them back, and I'm glad I'm not going to be here to find out what happens when they're not being held back. That's getting a little off topic, and we can talk about that another day too. But yeah, as far as it still makes me wonder how they did it, especially after the flood. Before the flood, we can speculate how technologically advanced they were, but you said it, we haven't been able to do that until the 60s, 1960s. So how are they doing it? Even with angelic help, how are they doing it way back then? You know,
Yep.
that's
It's a
unfortunately I may never have the answer to that question, but it's something I wonder about a lot when we talk about this and we talk about the genetic mutations they created way back then.
yeah. They there's a strange verse in Genesis where it talks about one of the descendants of Canaan who's taken his sheep off into this remote area where people don't go a lot. And um, it seems to be a strange verse. Why is that mentioned? Well, some of the other books that the Bible also directs us to, they're not scripture, but they are good history, like Jasher and whatnot. They expand upon this story and tell us that what it's referring to, the Bible doesn't go into it a whole lot, but what it's referring to is this incident where this man came across the instructions on how to mix and how to create these beings. Whether it had, I think it was mentioned as being on a stone tablet, and he found it. And from then on out, mankind began to again dabble. Apparently, though, the impression you get is that it did not require, I said petri dish earlier, and that's kind of jesting. It did not require there to be necessarily a laboratory, that it had a lot more to do with potions and whatnot. And there was some technique, and I don't know if we even do it the same now when they're mixing animals now, if they do it the same way or not. I really don't know. But clearly the angels showed them how to do it. And to some extent they were successful, because in my opinion, it's just my opinion, the cryptids that we have now are the result of the post-flood tampering. It's interesting that it talks about Nimrod, the Bible says, became a Gibborim. He became a mighty man, which is a term used for giant. Almost like he wasn't before, something was done and he became one. And so it's just the Bible also goes in and talks about that there were those that differentiates between those who were born to the giant as opposed to those who were giants. So some people theorize that like Og, the giant in the Bible talked about as Og, that he was actually born to the angels. And if that's the case, he would have been around pre-flood. And so how was he still here post-flood? There's all sorts of different theories that people have, and we're just never going to know. I don't think the Lord really intends for us to know a lot of this. It's fun to speculate about. But the main thing for me, and the reason why I think doing this show is important, is my puzzle is put together enough at this point that I'm satisfied that I have a general idea of what has gone on and what is still going on, and that it's something that I don't want to be involved with. I don't go out looking for these beings. I'm very interested in the subject matter, but not just like I'm interested in military history. I'm not going to go off and volunteer to fight in a war. I stay way clear of these creatures and anything of the sort. And I think it's important for people to understand how much of this is going on, because that's really, and I'm sure, Jeff, I'll turn this over to you, but I'm sure you understand what I mean with you studying this as much as I do, if not more. It's mind-boggling to see both sides of this, because you see people who have no clue that all this stuff is going on. Or if they hear about it, they immediately scoff, which people say that's a sign of fear, which probably is true. They're afraid that it's true. But then you have all these other people who are experiencing it. And it's not just, I won't say it's common, but it's not rare either. Most people are not experiencing this, but there's enough accounts going on right now to keep how many YouTube channels going with new episodes, new content all the time. Oh, well, some of those are made up. Maybe a few of them are, but clearly not all of them are. And we know how are all these different people making up the exact same story? I mean, they're all talking about things that, for example, the phone, the pictures showing up on the phone. We got two different people, a physicist and a guy in Ontario, that are talking about this happening. Do we really think they got together and said, hey, let's call YouTube channels that deal with monsters and tell them the same story? And he convinced a physicist to do this. I don't buy that. And so, and the fact that it lines up with Enoch and what they were talking about back then, it all just comes together to the point where like you said earlier, You can't just blow it off.
Yeah, it's almost like there's a secret club that they all decide they want to join. They get initiated, then they get handed out the rules and parameters of what to include in their encounters, and it's like, well, you have to hit this major point, this major point, you know. So it's not that. It's all over the world too. It's not just in the U.S. and not just in Europe. It's everywhere. So I don't know. I just and you know, I think the internet has played a huge role in people being able to get their stories out there because before, I mean, we don't know how many before the internet. I've heard stories that have happened back in the 80s, back in the 70s, in the 60s. You know, the first Dogman uh, encounter was like early 1900s, late 1800s, or something like that. And then,
Middle Ages.
right, yeah, exactly. So it's crazy to think about how many encounters took place before the internet, where people just couldn't at the you know have the access to put their story out online. There's all kinds of Reddit. Anybody can go post in a Reddit forum and have their story read in a matter of minutes. So I think the internet has played a huge part in this. I don't think it's anything new. I think a lot of people like to think that, you know, this is all new, but it's not new because people get on there. They're in their 50s, 60s, even sometimes even older, and they're like, well, this happened to me back in the 30s and 40s. Well, maybe not the 30s and 40s, but you know, back in the 60s and 70s,
right,
50s. You know, so it's just I think there's just way too much evidence out there for. You know, like you said, I think people scoff at it and turn a blind eye because they're either afraid or they don't want to accept the truth because it might affect their view of reality. But I don't know, it's crazy. But I was going to mention earlier in the episode, you almost found yourself in a gifting situation
yeah.
by accident, and we this is part of this series. I forget what part it is where you told your story about how you believe there's Sasquatch activity in the area where you live, and there's a lot of compelling evidence that points to that being the case. Where you threw an old what was it, a turkey, right? You threw an old turkey into the woods, and then you found a couple of things in your driveway not too long after. That very well could have turned into habituation type situation there, and it's a good thing. Like, see, you're well educated on the topic, so you probably saw that, and you're like, okay, I'm done. You know, I'm not trying to interact with these beings anymore, so I'm just not gonna do anything else. But how easy could it have been for you to be? I don't want to say godless, and you know, or you know, that fascinated with this that you go out and that you're missing something in your life and you try to find it here, and that you start putting other things in the woods.
Right. Yeah.
And you know, it could start off harmless and innocent, a mistake, even like your situation almost did. It could start off as a mistake and harmless. And you're like, oh wow, these creatures are friendly. It left me feathers, or I don't want to say it's friendly. It left me a dead bird, but or no, it was sticks, wasn't it? It wasn't a dead bird. It was sticks.
No, it was a dead bird.
Okay, that's what I thought. Yeah, and then another time it was
feathers.
sticks. Yeah,
and sticks and feathers. Yeah.
So
and this morning it was a rock.
Oh wow, really? Just today?
Yeah.
Jeez, how big was the rock?
I don't. It was small, but
Oh, okay.
and I don't know. I don't know if it was anything to it. I was walking the dog. Where I live, we don't have rocks. I mean, there are rocks if you go down far enough, but we live in a very rare part of the country where if you go fishing and whatnot, you're not going to see rocks. You don't. We don't have. You know, I've encountered over the years. I probably planted 200 trees, 300 trees on my property, and digging for those trees, I think I've dug up 4 or 5 rocks and digging 200 holes. We just don't have many. You just don't see them. And today, walking along the lake with the dog, I look down and there's a log there and a rock laying on top of the log. And it was just bizarre. You know, how did that get there? Now, a squirrel could have found a rock somewhere and taken it and dropped it on the log. It's possible. And then I went a couple dozen yards further, and there was another one in the middle of the trail. And it wasn't there a few days ago when I was walking through. I mean, there's like everything else on that whole big list of things that have happened around here. It can be explained away. One thing that's harder to explain away that happened about 3 weeks ago, and that is last October. I was riding lawnmower, cutting back by the woods, the grass, and had this overwhelming feeling of joy and peace and whatnot. It was really amazing. I mean, I was like, gosh, what did that, what brought that? That was really great. I used to have them a lot when I was younger. I didn't think much of it. And then, like I said, we recently got a new dog, and I was walking him around about 5:15 in the morning, doing a walk, and we went around the yard back by the woods, and was in the exact same spot when I was on the lawnmower back in October, and was hit with this exact same wave out of the blue. Like I said, it's pitch black outside in the back, back by the woods, of this overwhelming just wave of peace, joy, happiness, just bizarre. It lasted for 10 to 15 seconds, and I kept right on walking, and it was gone. There are quite a few reports in these encounters where people describe this as happening from cryptids. Overwhelmingly, it's the opposite. It's negative feelings of dread and fear and whatnot. But there's probably a good quarter, 25%, where the people say, I saw this thing, but instead of being terrified, I had this overwhelming fear of peace and comfort and whatnot. And I don't know if it was anything or not, but why would I have two of the feelings in the exact same part of the yard 4 months, 5 months apart? And in my mind, I wonder if it's not them again trying to open up some sort of, relationship type thing. And then with the rocks and whatnot, and just different things. But I just kept right on going. I'm not gonna pursue that in the least. And it may have been nothing. I've mentioned all this thing. The rabbits being killed may have been nothing. The boat being destroyed may have been nothing. The neighbor being shouted at may have been nothing. The trees falling in the woods when we were walking out may have been nothing. And it goes on and on and on and on and on. I imagine a lot of people. I know a lot of people are having these types of things around the country, and we've had confirmed sightings a mile down the road here, about 3 miles down the road there, and about 10 miles down the road, we know there's a family living in a swamp. At least certain times of the year, they're in the swamp. So, and we have the Dismal Swamp right over that direction, which is really most known for Dogman sightings. So, who knows? It continues. It's been going on for 30 years around here. As long as it keeps this withdrawn and whatnot, because when I'm out there walking in the dark, and I'm not concerned at all. I'm not afraid in the least. Just my attitude is the Lord's watching over our property. I'm not concerned about it. And my biggest problem with it is being outside at that early in the morning. I don't like, but what do you do?
Right. I'll have to get a camera like Scott Carpenter and put it on the facing backward and see what you can catch behind you. But I can see how people would be intrigued enough to pursue that avenue. I'm not. I want nothing to do with it like you. I don't want any part of that, because I know that deep down it's I don't want to say they all have ulterior motives, because like I said, there are positive encounters with these beings, but I just don't think the habituation thing is positive. I don't think it is. Me either. I don't think that they have our best interest at heart when they start these types of relationships with us. There's just something about it that strikes me as these people need to be careful, and they need to. Honestly, I don't know how you would get out of it if you've been in it for generations. Because like that woman who was dragged out of her house, who knows how they would take that rejection, take that, you not wanting any part of it anymore. And it's just something that anytime this topic comes up, anytime I hear it in a story, something in the back of my mind just kind of gnaws at me, and is just like, there's nothing good can come from it. It's just something that, a feeling I get in my gut that tells me that that's not right. You shouldn't be doing that. People shouldn't be doing that. And I don't know if it's the Lord telling me. I don't know if it's my discernment that He's gifted me with, but knowing what I do about these creatures and what I've been able to form based on the many stories I've heard and read. I just, I don't know, something just seems off about it to me, and I don't think it's something that people should be doing. But that's all I had for this one. Did you have anything else you wanted to touch on before we?
Just that a couple of these habituation incidences, what's interesting is they're done by children, and the on both sides they're young squatches, young forest people, whatever you want to call them, and young humans. There's two of these in particular. One of them again is on Brenton Sawin's channel, and the other one I forget where I heard that one. But in both cases, when these creatures got to a certain age, they made it clear they had to leave, that there was a change that was going to come upon them, and they can no longer hang out with these kids. And it was a situation where the one kid, and I'll give you, Jeff, the links so if people want to listen to these accounts, because to go on to describe it here would take too long.
Right.
But
yeah, I'll put all of them in the description.
Yeah.
Below. So
the families were not participating. This was something where the kids were going out into the woods, and it just kind of develops over time where they're playing. And the one guy who's not into this subject at all, he says, I always thought it was funny that I never saw her lips moving when she talked to me. And it seemed like she always talked when I wasn't looking directly at her. I mean, he was having mind speak is what she was doing. And he just wasn't aware of it because he was a kid. He was like 6 or 7 years old. And it's extremely interesting. And he gets a little, choked up about it. You could tell he's had some stress over it. And he had a kind of a hard life, but he's a real, likable guy. And so I just think it's interesting that some of these that we've had are again with the kids. And it's interesting to see how they, almost like human kids, how they start, they seek him out. He doesn't seek them out. All of a sudden he notices his kite being played with, and over in like a field over is like, who's playing with my kite? And then, it's funny to hear how he, at his little kid mind, he's wondering, boy, these people are dirty, and why do they have so much hair? And it's really, have you ever listened to his account?
No, I haven't.
It's interesting. No. It really is. It occurs in remote Pennsylvania, out towards the West Virginia line is where it happens. And he's, out in the middle of nowhere living with foster parents. So he's living with foster parents, and there's no kids around to play. And so he has to play out in the woods by himself. And these beings, now people can say he's making it all up, but with this guy, you can see it's a video. He's not just talking. He's actually, you can see him describing it and whatnot. And it's just very interesting. I've heard it once before, but I rewatched it last week just because. And the Brenton Sawin channel was the first one that really got me listening to this stuff on YouTube. And like you said, Jeff, earlier, there is no doubt that the internet has been absolutely huge. Because before, those of us who were interested in this topic, we had one documentary that was done on A&E. We had one In Search Of documentary that was done 40 minutes long in the 70s. And then another one that was done in 1980 by Arthur C. Clarke. And that was basically it. I mean, so you have 3 documentaries with maybe a dozen eyewitness accounts, and we had to wait for them to come on TV, and then we could record them sometimes and then watch them over and over and over and over. But the amount of information that we got from those 3 documentaries was about equivalent to a magazine. Whereas now with the internet, you have a huge multi-level library at your fingertips. So we were in the Stone Ages back then. We were in the complete darkness. We didn't have any idea of what this phenomenon really was about. You had the Patterson film. That was the only footage anybody knew about. And all of us could look at it and tell something's not right. That's not a man in a suit. But yet you really couldn't go anywhere. There was a few books on this. They weren't bad, but there was just a couple. They always seemed to be outdated. So the internet completely turned this subject on its head, in my opinion, more than any other subject out there. No subject has been as affected by the internet as the cryptid one. It's astonishing. It's astonishing.
Yeah. And it's like you said, in those 3 documentaries, how many patterns could you pick up on? How many?
None.
Different situations that repeated over and over and over in these stories that there's you go on Reddit and you start reading through these stories and you start to see the same feelings that people fear, the dread and the fear, and just sometimes like complete despair, and they're just afraid, like that instinctual I need to get out of here right now, fight or flight reflex. And then the same things happen over and over in these stories, that it's just, to me, undeniable that. And not to mention all the videos that surface, like the Yellowstone, excuse me, the Yellowstone camera that was filming Old Faithful, and you can clearly see four figures in the background moving through the trees, and everybody wants to be like, oh, that's just park rangers, or the people who work there. And it's like, how can they move through that deep of snow that smoothly and walk like they do? And they move so quickly. No human can walk that fast through snow. And the amount of ground that they cover in that short amount of time is just ridiculous. And then there's the video that you sent me, where that Sasquatch, and I'll try to see if I can find this, and I might just put it up on the screen while we're talking about it right here, where this thing is at a crime scene, and it is throwing around huge trees, big trees that even like bodybuilders would have trouble lifting and throwing around, and this thing's just throwing around like they're toothpicks. And I'm really gonna see if I can find that video. And there's another one I saw recently too, that I'll try to see if I can find that one. I'll put those up right now while we're talking about it. And it looks exactly like the one that you sent me, with this thing thrown around not just trees, logs, huge logs it's thrown around with ease. And you can see its face, and I can see why people call them people. They call them people. They don't call them human, but they say they look just like people. And this thing's face looks just like, I don't want to say mine or yours, but it looks human almost. It looks like a person, but it's just completely covered in hair. And it's exactly like how a lot of accounts on, I'll bring him up since you haven't yet. I'm surprised you haven't. Steve Ischaw's channel. A lot of people describe them that way when they write into him. Talk about another channel that the internet has made, where people have access to get their stories out, because he sits down and reads email after email after email, day after day after day, of accounts you can't find anywhere else. They're just writing into him. So, and just like I mentioned, there's patterns in these encounters, that unless all these people, millions of people, I don't want to say millions, but thousands of people, maybe even hundreds of thousands.
Oh yeah.
By this point, all get together and they all decide, okay, these are the things that you have to put into this story to make it believable enough to where people will believe it on the internet. But those videos are just, they're really something else, and I'll see if I can find them and put them up.
And I think that needs to be a subject of our next episode. We were going to do some of it here, but we never got a chance. And that is some of these patterns that your average person is not aware of, that show up over and over and over again in these sightings. Because there's things like you've mentioned a couple, there's so many of them that we could go through that are just bizarre. And people could not make all this up on their own. I think that would be a really good topic.
Yeah, let's do it. I'll start compiling a list, because there's some things I'm trying to think of now that they're just slipping my mind. So I'll make a list, and it's just, and some of it pertains to certain types of cryptids, like Sasquatch have, and that's just another thing. Is certain types of cryptids have certain types of behaviors that appear in these stories over and over, and it's just, it's too much for me to just dismiss it all, So, but if unless you had anything else to add, I'll go ahead and close this out. We don't do this for the views or the likes or to try to get as many subscribers as possible. We certainly are not trying to get internet famous or make money off this channel. We just started this podcast and channel to try and put the message out that we believe that God wants us to convey. When we first started talking about doing this channel, Jerry, I know we talked about how we had things that we felt like God was compelling us to touch on, and it's this is about as pretty far out there as we'll get with cryptids, and sometimes we'll talk about UFOs and stuff. But if you get into our other videos, it's stuff that you probably won't hear in church, because it mostly involves the end times, what we talk about here, and we wanted to do that. We wanted to do subjects that you normally don't hear about, that Christians turn a blind eye or a blind ear to, because we feel like it's important to get it out there. So that's why we do this, and no other reason to try to make money or anything like that. Not to try to get as many subscribers as possible. If we did get million subscribers, that'd be great, because we'd be getting the word out there. But you'll never see a shop on this channel selling merchandise, and we're not we're not in it for that. We're just trying to convey God's word that we feel like needs to be out there. Topics that aren't talked about, like I just said. So I know I start to repeat myself a little bit when I get into these things, but was there anything else you wanted to add to that, Jerry? All right, well, thank you for watching. If you're interested in this topic, this is part 7 of this series. We're definitely gonna be coming back to it at some point. So part 8, with all of our series on our channel, we leave them open, and you never know when we'll be back to it. But this is one that Jerry and I found a lot of interest in, and we'll be back at it at some point. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you at the next episode. God bless.